Okay, let's unpack this. Today we are taking a deep dive into one specific, incredibly detailed piece of research. The full title is Pathway to a Fully Sustainable Energy System for Bolivia across power, heat, and transport sectors by 2050.
That's right. And the central question this study tackles is, well, ambitious. Could Bolivia transition to a 100% sustainable energy system powered entirely by renewable sources by the year 2050?
And not just electricity, right? Across power, heat, and transport.
Exactly. And crucially, they model this to see if it's both, technically feasible and economically competitive.
So the source material we're digging into is this academic paper. It uses a pretty sophisticated tool, the LUT Energy System Transition Model.
Yes, that's the one. And it pulls in a whole load of data about Bolivia's current energy situation, demographics, and really importantly, its renewable resource potential.
And our mission for you, the listener, is to really zero in on what this study actually found. We want to understand how one country, and maybe it's representative of others in similar Sunbelt regions, could fundamentally change its energy future. What are the big insights? Any surprises in the data?
Definitely some interesting points in there.
Okay, so let's start with where Bolivia stood. According to this study's data from around, 2015, 2020, what did the energy landscape look like then?
Well, the picture painted by their data is one heavily, heavily reliant on fossil fuels. Back in 2015, something like 85% of Bolivia's total primary energy supply came from fossil sources.
85%. Wow.
Yeah, and they were in this kind of curious position, increasing imports of petrol, but at the same time being pretty significant exporters of natural gas.
That seems contradictory.
It is an interesting dynamic. The data from 2016 showed gas exports making up nearly 46% of their total export value. So a big earner.
Huh. A real economic dependency there. And the power sector specifically, how did that look?
Almost entirely built on natural gas. This study notes that close to 95% of their electricity generation capacity was from thermoelectric plants, running on gas.
95% gas for electricity. Okay.
And the study also mentions the grid structure split between the main national interconnected system, the SIN, and then various isolated systems.
Got it. Now, the study also brings up Bolivia's vulnerability to climate change impacts, even though its own global emissions are relatively low.
Absolutely. And the analysis within this study points out something quite striking. The vast majority of Bolivia's emissions, around 77% back in 2009, didn't actually come from burning fuel in the energy sector.
Oh, where from then?
Land use changes, mostly deforestation. The energy sector itself was only about 21% of the emissions pie back then.
Right, that's a really important distinction. So, okay, a fossil fuel heavy foundation, this weird gas export, petrol import thing, climate vulnerability despite low energy emissions. What about existing policies? Did the study look at Bolivia's energy goals at the time?
It did. It highlights goals like energy sovereignty, security, universal access, efficiency, things like that. Goals that generally point towards more renewables and less fossil dependence.
What? I sense a but coming.
Well, the but is that the study also notes a key challenge. Finding readily available, official, long-term government energy projections that went beyond 2030. They needed something to compare their own 2050 model against, and those long-term government plans weren't detailed in the sources they consulted.
Ah, okay. So hard to benchmark against official long-term strategy. And what about specific hurdles? Did this study identify concrete barriers holding back renewables in Bolivia?
Oh, yeah. Several significant ones. The analysis points to a lack of specific regulations really tailored for renewables, particularly for off-grid systems.
Which are often crucial for expanding access, right?
Exactly. Also, insufficient incentives for research and development or just spreading knowledge about the technologies. And then there's the price. Energy prices and tariffs just weren't really set up to encourage renewables.
And subsidies, often a big factor.
A huge one here. The study mentions substantial fossil fuel subsidies over 5% of GDP just for oil products. Plus, and this is key, a lack of any real greenhouse gas emissions pricing. No carbon tax, no cap and trade mentioned in their sources.
So put together, those factors make it tough for renewables to compete purely on upfront economics in that existing system.
Precisely. It stacks the deck against them, economically speaking.
Okay, so that's the starting line and the obstacles.
Yeah.
How did this study then go about modeling a totally different future, this really ambitious 100% renewable path to 2050?
They use this LUT energy system transition model. It's a pretty powerful tool. It does cost-optimal simulations, figuring out the cheapest way to meet energy demand.
And it's detailed, you said.
Very. It runs with hourly resolution for an entire year. That's absolutely critical if you want to properly capture the variability of things like solar and wind energy and figure out how to balance them.
Right, you can't just average it out over a month. You need to know what happens hour by hour.
Exactly, and it couples together all the main energy sectors: power, heat, transport, even desalination, looking at how they interact. It uses a library of, I think, 108 different technology components.
Wow, 108 different bits of kit it can choose from.
Yeah, everything from solar panels and wind turbines to electrolyzers, batteries, different heating systems, fuel synthesis plants.
And it uses real weather data.
Yes, that's crucial too. It incorporates real weather data to estimate how much renewable energy, like solar and wind, would be available hour by hour across different regions of Bolivia.
And Bolivia's potential there.
Is immense, especially solar. The study really emphasizes this. Their analysis shows Bolivia is right up there, among the top countries globally for solar irradiation levels. Just a huge resource waiting to be tapped.
Okay, amazing potential. How did the model handle future energy demand? Did it just assume things stay the same?
No. It projected demand out to 2050. It basically extrapolated from trends they saw between 2015 and 2030, assuming continued growth in population and, importantly, increased energy access for more people.
And did any particular sector's demand growth stand out?
Yes, the projection for heat demand was particularly striking. It showed really significant growth, especially driven by industrial processes, projected at nearly 10% annual growth in the early phase of the model.
10% annual growth in heat demand. That's massive.
It is. Overall, final energy demand across all sectors was projected to roughly double by 2050 compared to the 2015 levels, so a big increase in service demand.
And they didn't just model one single pathway, did they? I think the outline mentioned 3 different scenarios.
Correct. They looked at 3 distinct possible futures for Bolivia. Let's call them BPS-1, BPS-2, and BPS-3.
Okay, what's the difference?
Right, so BPS-1 gets to 100% renewable energy by 2050. It includes a cost for greenhouse gas emissions, basically making pollution expensive, and it prioritizes a distributed energy system.
Distributed meaning more local generation.
Yeah, think energy generation closer to where it's actually used. This minimizes the need for building huge amounts of long-distance power lines.
Okay, that's BPS-1. What about BPS-2?
BPS-2 also reaches 100% renewable energy by 2050, and it also includes those greenhouse gas costs. But the key difference is it models a more centralized system.
Centralized how?
It focuses energy production way out in the regions that have the absolute best renewable resources, the sunniest deserts, the windiest plains. But because generation is far from demand centers, this version requires building a lot more high-capacity transmission lines to move the power around.
Got it. So 100% RE, GHG costs, but distributed versus centralized generation and transmission. And BPS-3.
BPS-3 is the comparison case. It does not apply any cost to greenhouse gas emissions. And critically, the transport sector isn't forced to switch entirely to synthetic fuels made from renewables. It can keep using fossil fuels if they turn out to be cheaper in the model under those conditions.
So BPS-3 shows what might happen without strong climate policies pushing the transition.
Exactly. It serves as a baseline to see how much difference those policies make.
Okay, so 2 ambitious 100% green paths, one distributed, one centralized, and a less constrained comparison. What's the big picture finding? What does the overall energy system look like in those 100% renewable scenarios, BPS-1 and BPS-2?
The single biggest takeaway, the headline finding from this study, is just this massive, overwhelming shift towards electrification across pretty much every sector.
Everything runs on electricity.
Increasingly, yes.
Yeah.
Now, the total amount of primary energy needed actually increases because overall demand grows. But, and this is important, the study notes really substantial efficiency gains in how energy is used.
Because electric motors are more efficient than combustion engines, heat pumps more than boilers, that kind of thing.
Precisely. They found final energy savings of up to 26% compared to a baseline scenario without this kind of transition, just due to improved efficiency. And in BPS-1 and BPS-2, renewable electricity doesn't just grow its share. It becomes the absolutely dominant source of primary energy. Fossil fuels are completely phased out by 2050 in those scenarios.
Completely phased out. Wow. Okay, massive electrification. Let's break that down. What about the power sector itself? Where does the electricity come from?
The analysis is crystal clear on this. Solar PV. Specifically, single-axis tracking solar PV becomes the absolute workhorse of the system.
Single-axis tracking, so panels that follow the sun.
Exactly. The study projects it will be the dominant electricity source by 2050, in all 3 scenarios, actually, providing something like 93% of total generation.
93% solar. That's huge. What does that mean for capacity?
It means an astronomical increase. They started with just 0.13 gigawatts of solar in 2020 in their data. The model projects needing potentially over 110 gigawatts by 2050 in the high-demand scenarios.
Whoa, that's an incredible build-out rate. What about other renewables? Wind, hydro?
They play smaller but still necessary roles. Hydro, wind, geothermal, even some combined heat and power plants running on waste or biogas are all part of the optimal mix found by the model. But they're supporting players compared to solar PV.
And those gas power plants that dominate today, what happens to them?
The study shows they pretty much fade away as fossil fuel users. They might stick around in very small capacities in BPS-1 and BPS-2, but only if they switch to running on synthetic gas or biomethane that's produced from renewable sources later on.
So they become part of the renewable system, effectively, if they survive at all.
Right. No more fossil gas burning in those scenarios.
Okay, let's move to heat. You mentioned that huge projected growth, especially industrial heat. How does that sector decarbonize in the model?
Well, with that massive increase in demand, it needs a dramatic shift away from today's reliance on natural gas and traditional biomass. The study finds the heat sector largely gets electrified too.
More electrification, so things like electric boilers or...
Primarily things like electric district heating systems and heat pumps become dominant. They're supplemented by some district heating systems that initially run on methane but then transition over to synthetic gas. And some specific biomass technologies also contribute.
And what makes this possible? Why does electrification win out for heat?
The key driver, according to the study, is the low cost of all that renewable electricity being generated, mainly by the massive amount of solar PV. Cheap, clean electricity makes electric heating options the most cost-effective solution in the model.
Right, the economics just flip. Oh, and transport, another sector that's, heavily tied to fossil fuels right now.
Another major transformation projected there. The study sees a strong move away from conventional petrol and diesel cars towards hybrid vehicles and especially battery electric vehicles, BEVs.
Makes sense. But what about things like planes and ships, harder to run on batteries?
Exactly, and that's where the scenarios differ a bit. For those segments, aviation, marine, maybe some heavy trucking that are difficult to electrify directly, BPS-1 and BPS-2 rely on synthetic fuels.
Synthetic fuels, like what?
Things like renewable Fischer-Tropsch fuels, which are like synthetic diesel or kerosene, and also hydrogen, both produced using renewable electricity.
Ah, the power-to-X concept again. Using electricity to make fuel.
Precisely. It's basically storing renewable energy in a chemical form. The study shows producing these synthetic fuels actually requires a pretty significant chunk of the total electricity demand in those fully renewable scenarios.
And in BPS-3, the comparison case.
In BPS-3, where there isn't that policy push like a GHG cost, the model finds it cheaper for those sectors to just stick with conventional fossil liquid fuels.
So policy really matters for decarbonizing those harder-to-abate transport sectors.
Absolutely critical, based on these findings.
The study also mentioned desalination, which seems odd for landlocked Bolivia, but you said it's in there.
Yes, it's a small part. Water demand is projected to grow, but desalination remains, a minor fraction of the total water supply by 2050 in their model, mostly using reverse osmosis powered by renewables.
But the weird part.
The unique point the study mentions is that for Bolivia to get desalinated water, presumably from the Pacific, the infrastructure pipelines, maybe, would need to cross borders.
Ah, which could have political implications, needing agreements with neighbors.
Exactly. Just a small detail, but an interesting real-world complexity flagged.
Okay, so the picture is massive solar-driven electrification across power, heat, and transport. For the tricky bits, synthetic fuels made from clean electricity. But making this all work reliably, hour by hour, must require some key enabling tech, right? What did the study highlight?
Storage. Storage is absolutely fundamental. The study really hammers this point home. You need both electricity storage and heat storage to balance a system that's so heavily dominated by variable renewables like solar.
Makes sense. What kinds of storage did the model deploy?
For electrical storage, it uses a mix: pumped hydro energy storage, or PHES, which is like a big water battery, utility scale batteries like the lithium-ion ones we're seeing more of, and also something called AC.
ACs, you mentioned that briefly, adiabatic compressed air.
Adiabatic compressed air energy storage, yeah. Essentially, you use excess electricity to compress air and store it, often underground. Then, when you need power, you release the air to drive a turbine. The adiabatic part means it tries to capture and reuse the heat generated during compression, making it more efficient.
Clever. Okay, so electrical storage, what about heat storage?
The study includes that too. Things like large tanks for storing hot water for district heating, sometimes called TES or thermal energy storage, and also storage for higher temperature heat needed by industry. Plus, storing the synthetic or biomethane in gas storage facilities counts as thermal storage too.
And does this storage actually contribute a lot of energy?
Oh, yes. The study shows these various storage solutions providing a significant portion of the total energy output by 2050 in those BPS-1 and BPS-2 scenarios, smoothing out the supply from the variable renewables.
Okay, storage is crucial. What about moving the electricity around? How did the grid infrastructure look different between the distributed BPS-1 and centralized BPS-2 scenarios?
Yeah, this is where they really diverge. BPS-1, the distributed one where generation is more local, keeps the need for interregional transmission relatively low. The model finds a maximum capacity needed between regions of around 6 or 7 gigawatts.
Still sounds like a lot, but compared to?
Compared to BTS-2, the centralized approach. Because BTS-2 puts huge power plants way out in the best resource areas, it needs much, much higher transmission capacity to get that power to cities and industry. We're talking potentially up to 25 gigawatts of interregional capacity needed.
Wow, nearly 4 times as much grid build-out between regions in the centralized case.
Right. It's a major infrastructure difference between the two pathways.
And does this shift where the power hubs are within Bolivia?
It does, according to the model. The study shows regions with the best solar resources becoming the big net exporters of electricity within Bolivia. In BPS-1, that's Chuquisaca. In BPS-2, it's Potosi, which has phenomenal solar potential.
Which is different from today.
Very different. The study notes that currently the Department of Tarija is the main exporter, mainly because of its natural gas power plants, so the energy geography completely flips.
Fascinating. Okay, let's talk money. Costs, investments. What did the study find on the economic side? This is often the sticking point.
This is probably one of the most compelling parts of the study. It finds that, yes, the nature of the costs changes dramatically. You shift from a system where annual costs are dominated by buying fuel, natural gas, oil, to one where costs are dominated by the upfront capital expenditure, the CapEx, of building all the solar farms, batteries, grid lines, etc.
Okay, so big upfront investment, but the total cost over time.
Here's the really surprising and frankly crucial insight from this study. While the total absolute costs do increase because energy demand grows and you need all this new kit, the study calculates that the actual price per unit of energy delivered is lower in the fully sustainable system by 2050 compared to the estimated levels in 2015.
Wait, hang on. Lower cost per kilowatt hour or per unit of heat, even with all that investment?
That's what their modeling suggests, yes. It really challenges that common assumption that going 100% renewable has to be drastically more expensive for the end user.
How is that possible? What drives that lower unit cost?
The study points to a few key things. Number one, overwhelmingly, is the dramatically falling cost of solar PV. Their model assumes continued cost reductions, making solar incredibly cheap. Then you add in the affordability of the necessary storage solutions and the efficiency gains from electrification we talked about. Plus, the costs for electrolyzers and the whole power-to-X process also become competitive in their projections.
So cheap solar is the bedrock.
It really seems to be the cornerstone of the economic viability in this model. They calculated the overall levelized cost of energy, the LCOE, for the whole system. It reduces from about 45 euros per megawatt hour back in 2015 to around 33 euros per MWh in the fully sustainable scenarios, BPS-1 and BPS-2, by 2050.
33 euros. And the comparison case, BPS-3.
Even BPS-3, which still uses some fossil fuels and doesn't pay for GHG emissions, comes in slightly lower, around 30 euros per MWH. But the key point is that the 100% renewable scenarios are very cost competitive. And the LCOE for solar PV itself just plummets in their model over the decades.
Incredible. Okay, economically viable, maybe even cheaper per unit. What about the environmental outcome?
Yeah.
Greenhouse gases.
The study's conclusion here is stark and positive for the ambitious scenarios. In BPS-1 and BPS-2, greenhouse gas emissions from all energy sectors, power, heat, transport, are completely eliminated by 2050. Zero emissions.
From 22 million tons in 2020, you said earlier.
Yes, down from 22 million tons of CO2 equivalent in 2020 to zero by 2050 for energy-related emissions.
And BPS-3, the one without the strong policies.
That scenario, BPS-3, retains significant emissions, especially from transport using fossil fuels and some remaining fossil use in the heat sector. This really underscores the study's point. You need those policy drivers, like putting a price on carbon or having clear regulations to achieve that full defossilization. The market alone, in their model, doesn't get you all the way there.
Right. Policy matters. So let's try and summarize the big takeaways. The study finds a 100% renewable energy system for Bolivia is technically feasible, economically viable, maybe even cheaper per unit of energy, driven mainly by super cheap solar and widespread electrification, and it completely wipes out energy sector emissions.
That's a pretty good summary of the headline findings, yes. The overarching conclusion is really powerful. It suggests Bolivia could do this by 2050, meeting significant demand growth, and it works whether you go for a more distributed approach or a more centralized one.
And the key levers enabling that low cost again were
Low-cost solar PV, first and foremost. Affordable energy storage. High levels of sector coupling, using electricity across heat and transport. And affordable power-to-X processes, starting with making renewable hydrogen.
how did this study compare itself to other research that's been done on energy transitions in, say, South America?
Well, this study notes that its approach is a bit different. Many previous studies might have focused only on the power sector, not the whole energy system, including heat and transport. Or they looked at larger regional grids, not specifically just Bolivia. Or maybe they projected bigger roles for things like hydropower or other dispatchable renewables. This analysis really lands on solar PV being overwhelmingly dominant in the most cost-effective future mix for Bolivia.
And it didn't shy away from mentioning some of the tricky bits, the complexities beyond just the energy model.
No, it didn't. It raises important points, like the potential social and environmental impacts if you were to build lots of large new hydropower dams. It mentioned that desalination challenge needing cross-border cooperation.
And the lithium issue. Bolivia has huge lithium reserves, right?
Yeah.
Essential for batteries.
Exactly. The study acknowledges this massive potential resource for batteries, which are key to the transition. But it also correctly references other research highlighting the downsides, the high water use, the chemical intensity of lithium extraction, and potential social conflicts or impacts on things like local environments and even tourism in the salt flat regions.
So it flags that as a critical related issue that needs careful management, even if it's not in the energy system model itself.
Precisely. It acknowledges these external complexities that would absolutely be part of making this transition happen in reality.
And the study was also upfront about its own limitations.
Yes, which is good scientific practice. They mention things like maybe not having super detailed data on exactly how energy is used at the endpoint, the lack of those official long-term government plans to compare against directly, and the fact that their model treats Bolivia as an energy island.
Meaning it didn't look at potential electricity exports.
Right. It didn't model Bolivia potentially selling surplus solar power to its neighbors, which could change the economics again. They also focused on balancing energy hour by hour, not the split-second grid stability issues. Though they do briefly mention that modern inverters and batteries can provide things like artificial inertia to help with that, based on other studies.
But even with those caveats, that finding from BPS-3 about policy seems pretty clear-cut.
Absolutely. The fact that fossil fuels hang around in BPS-3 really highlights the study's conclusion that you need smart, targeted policies. Things like greenhouse gas taxes or strong incentives for renewables are crucial to drive the full transition. Economics alone might not be enough without that policy push.
What about funding this massive transition? Did the study look at how Bolivia might pay for it, maybe using its existing oil and gas money?
It touches on that. The analysis notes that Bolivia already has mechanisms to distribute revenues from its current hydrocarbon sector funds go to regional governments, cities, universities, and a development fund. So pathways exist, potentially, to channel some of that money towards renewable energy projects. Another but. But the study also references other research suggesting a potential inherent tension. If your goal is to maximize profits and surplus from the existing fossil fuel sector, that might conflict with goals like aggressively diversifying the energy supply or pushing for maximum energy efficiency, which could reduce fossil fuel demand domestically.
Right, a potential conflict of interest baked into the system. Did the study talk about the social upsides beyond just clean energy, like reducing energy poverty?
Yes, definitely. It suggests that scaling up solar PV, especially for off-grid communities that might lack reliable power now, has huge potential to reduce energy poverty and also help diversify the economy beyond just resource extraction.
The barriers remain there too.
Yes, it reiterates some of those earlier points, the need for better innovation policies, more investment in universities, and technical training to build local skills and capacity. And critically, it emphasizes the importance of involving local communities, ensuring social acceptance for new wind or solar farms, and perhaps using things like just transition funds.
Just transition funds to help communities currently dependent on fossil fuels.
Exactly. To ensure they aren't left behind and ideally benefit from the new clean energy economy being built. Addressing the social dimension is key.
And finally, the study suggests its findings aren't just about Bolivia.
Correct. They conclude that given Bolivia's location in the Sun Belt, its massive solar potential, the pathways and findings they've modeled offer valuable insights and are indicative for many other Sun Belt countries facing similar energy transition challenges and opportunities.
This deep dive into the pathway to a fully sustainable energy system for Bolivia across power, heat, and transport sectors by 2050 study has been genuinely eye-opening. It takes what might seem like a dry academic paper and pulls out this really powerful vision. A complete energy transformation isn't just theory, it could be technically doable and even economically smart.
It's quite compelling, isn't it? The core findings really stick with you. That massive shift to electrification, powered overwhelmingly by low-cost solar. The absolute need for energy storage and linking up the sectors, power, heat, transport.
And that surprising finding about potentially lower cost per unit of energy, despite all the investment needed. Plus, of course, getting to zero direct greenhouse gas emissions from the energy sector.
That's the goal, right? And this study lays out a plausible, data-driven pathway to get there, at least for Bolivia.
So thinking about what this detailed look at Bolivia's potential tells us about transitions elsewhere. Well, it really underscores the power of doing this kind of integrated planning, looking at the whole system, and how technology costs, especially solar, can just fundamentally change the game.
And the potential for efficiency gains for greater energy independence. It suggests these transformations are possible even for developing economies, though each country has its own specific context, of course. What really stands out to you thinking about this potential shift?
For me, it's that economic point. If the technical potential is there, and this study makes a strong case that the economics per unit of energy could actually be favorable, well, it reframes the whole debate, doesn't it?
It really does.
Right.
Which leads to that final thought, perhaps. Given the technical feasibility and the economic viability shown in this study, maybe the transition to a 100% sustainable energy system in countries like Bolivia with great resources is now less a question of can we possibly do this, and more a question of how quickly can the policies, the investments, and maybe the social consensus align to actually make it happen.